Welcome to the Adventure Joe podcast. I'm very excited and honored to welcome back John Guyant to the Adventure Joe podcast once again. John was on our inaugural podcast, and he was back by popular demand. I had numerous people reach out and ask if I'd planned to have John back on. So, John, welcome back, and thank you again for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Joe. Great to be back with you. Looking forward to today's conversation.
Absolutely. I know we got some good stuff on the schedule here, for sure. If you've not watched our first podcast, I highly recommend you do so, where we give a more detailed bio and background on John. But as a refresher and some highlights before we dive in to another exciting podcast and episode, let me go over that one more time in his fascinating history, background, and bio. Once again, John served our country for 40 years as a senior executive CIA officer and across all directions of the CIA, including covert action, paramilitary training, recruitment, CIA University, global logistics and planning, and also served at the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, which is responsible for our spy satellites. John actually shared on the first episode that one of those satellites in his early career actually had his name on it. It's pretty cool. Again, this is just a small refresher of John's background, and I highly recommend you watch our first podcast for even more details on his amazing career at CIA. John, you ready to dive into it?
Absolutely. Should be fun.
Let's do it. For many years, there's a place that exists that has drawn the fascination and imagination of many Americans and others from around the world. It has been the subject of several documentaries, Hollywood movies, conspiracy theories, and more. The place I am talking about is Area 51. And John, I understand you have been there during your time in service at the agency. Can you please share with viewers more about this historic place, some of its history, dispel some myths, and so on? Take it away.
All right, glad to do so, Joe. Now, okay, Area 51. Are we talking about the place where the United States captured flying saucers and the little green men that piloted them, and then where we've stored those aliens and those flying saucers and have done advanced experiments? Or are we talking about the Area 51 that's had patriots from the U.S. Air Force, the CIA, and industry that have done some incredible work with some amazing flying machines in service of our country, our national security, and other parts of the world? I'll tell you, spoiler right here, we're going to talk about the latter. The former can be fun sometimes. Yeah, who doesn't like a good conspiracy story, right? But I'll maybe get into that a little bit more later. But what I want to talk about is just the incredible mission that has taken place there, some of which I'll be able to get into because it has been declassified. Other things that have been done there remain classified, but really under the same general mission of being able to test highly advanced equipment and flying platforms in the service of our nation. So I'll get into a little bit about the place itself and then a little bit more about the mission, if that works for you.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I was looking forward to discussing more of the latter, because that's more the fascination. It really is the history of that place, what's been developed there, some of our aircraft and so forth. Area 51 was for a long time, a highly classified location, right? Air Force facility in Nevada. It was established in 1955 at another place there called Groom Lake. And it was kind of the first place in development of our U-2 spy plane. So with some of that history, I'll let you kind of take it from there. And as you already mentioned that, some of the declassification by CIA occurred in 2013, but other things that you mentioned as still classified, and they should be for our nation's defense. Absolutely. And viewers and those that don't go down that rabbit hole should hopefully respect that and realize that, true professionals and patriots like yourself and colleagues is really mostly what's probably going on there.
Absolutely. Let's talk.
So I will let you take it from there.
Absolutely, Joe. Glad to do so. Let's start talking about the area itself. And yeah, I have been there, and I'm really glad I was. In addition to the mission, to me, it's just a fascinating area, to be honest with you. I know you've enjoyed exploring and hiking and going on adventures, It's an incredible place to do that. The overall area, the deserts of Nevada, it's desolate. There's fascinating geology. There's history. It's right next to a desert national wildlife refuge. You've got mountain ranges. It's really, for those who love the desert Southwest, and I love visiting there, it's a great place to be in that area. It's also part of a larger Air Force and Department of Energy testing area. So the federal government owns a lot of land out there, as you might imagine, and it's a great place for testing, of which Area 51 is one part of a greater area of test facilities. When you drive into the area, you'll see craters from when we had nuclear explosion testing, which is kind of interesting. There's storage facilities. Yeah. It's really like another planet. It looks like something maybe from a movie that was made of something that took place on another planet. Just the geography and the geology. Going back in time a little bit, it used to be a mining area for lead and silver in the 1800s, and a prospector by the name of Bob Groom was there in the early days, and there's a range, a mountain range that's named after him. And so Groom Range, and then the dry lake bed, Groom Lake, that's where it got its name, after a prospector. So Groom Lake is where Area 51 is. It's a huge dry seabed. If you go through history, that area used to be a shallow sea millions and millions of years ago, but it turns out to be the perfect place to be able to have dry conditions. You don't want humidity when you're testing equipment, and very flat with large areas for takeoffs and landings. So it's just perfect. In fact, what happened was during the Cold War, the program was needing to get started, the U-2 program. And as they were flying around looking for a potential place, they looked down there and they said, this is exactly what we want. So that really became the start of where the U-2 program was going to be. A funny fact about it is pretty barren and not necessarily something that's going to attract people. So they called it Paradise Ranch, in the hopes that people might say, oh, yeah, who wouldn't want to go work at Paradise Ranch?
Sign me up.
Yeah, exactly right. But one of the things that's interesting also is they would fly, and still do today for the activities there, they would fly employees in from Las Vegas's airport in unmarked planes, and they would go back and forth. You don't really have a lot of road traffic going back in there. It's also, I think, as people know, a highly restricted area. And it's not because of the aliens that are there. It's because of our national security activities.
Dang it. I thought for sure you were going to give that up.
I know. It is kind of fun to teach people about what might be there, but it's going to disappoint them if they were really hoping they'd find aliens. But it has, in addition to the secure ground conditions, also the airspace is very protected. When they first stood up Area 51, it had about 60 square miles of protected airspace. It's about 10 times that size now. Everybody, thinks they can get in there and want to fly over and do their drones. A word of advice, please. Anybody listening to this, don't try to drive up to it. Don't try to hike up to it. Don't try to fly your drone over it. If you have a private pilot's license, please don't try to fly over the space there. Highly advise against that. But back to the Cold War, which really led to why we got the U-2 program, is, we'll go back in history a little bit. You and I kind of grew up in the latter stages of the Cold War, but for people right after World War II, there was a growing concern about what the Soviet Union was going to do with its expansion. And there was a great fear that we might have a World War III with the existential threat of nuclear weapons being used. And it was really that threat of nuclear weapons that drove the United States to say, we've got to have better reconnaissance of what is happening in the Soviet Union. So we, of course, we were using CIA officers to recruit spies in the Soviet Union, and we were having some pretty good successes in getting human intelligence. But it wasn't enough. We needed to be able to see what was the Soviet Union doing from a military standpoint. So that's where we needed to have better aerial reconnaissance. If you think back in the time, in the 50s, the aircraft back then were going to be flying pretty low, and they would have easily been taken out by the Russians if we tried to do a flight. So we had to come up with an air platform, a plane, that could fly very high and for very long distances. And so that was really the start of the U-2 program. It's code word. We always have to have code words on everything we do. The code word that the CIA came up with was called Aquatone, and really began from a program planning funding standpoint in 1954. I'll tell you, Joe, interestingly, a lot of people may not know that the U-2 has continued to be used even through today. Maybe not much longer. Its funding is looking to go away, and we have other platforms that work. But it has been one of the longest standing programs in the intelligence world and one of the most successful ever. It's been pretty impressive. So just a little bit about the U-2 program for your listeners. Why the U and why the 2? So everything about the U-2.
I'm glad you're going to touch on that.
Absolutely.
I had that as a note to ask you. How do the certain things that what you can share? How do they come up with their certain names?
So everything about the U-2 was guarded in secrecy. People that worked out there couldn't say anywhere close to where they were working. Area 51 didn't even exist. It wasn't until like 1998 that the Air Force acknowledged it. And then, as you said earlier, until 2013 that the CIA said we had involvement there. It was one of our most guarded secrets that we have. And so everything we did had to protect the security of it. So typically a reconnaissance plane would have the letter R designation, but instead they went with a U, which is for a utility aircraft. And there was already a U-1 in design and a U-3 in design. So they said, let's go with U-2. This was long before that Irish band, in case anybody's wondering out there. So they came up with U-2, Utility 2, for the name of the plane, so that people would think there's some kind of innocuous Air Force program going on. So that's where the name came up with. Pretty small workforce of CIA, Air Force, and contractors, and then in specific, Lockheed Martin. So there was a legend, and a true patriot, Kelly Johnson. He was the chief engineer of Skunk Works. Some people may have heard Skunk Works out in Burbank, California. They did all the, advanced avionics, new aircraft coming out for the Air Force. And they had done some things with the CIA to modify some aircraft for us. So the CIA went to him and they said, look, here's what we need. We need a plane that can fly really high, can fly really long, and can carry payloads to be able to spy on the Soviet Union. Kelly Johnson was all in. He delivered his program. Lockheed Martin delivered 20 aircraft on time, on budget, and under $1 million each at the time. No way could something like that be done today.
$1 million.
Less than $1 million per plane.
I mean, today that wouldn't even probably pay for a wheel.
No, absolutely. And even if you calculate it into today's dollars, it's still, there's no way we could come close to that. It was an amazing, both engineering and to be honest, acting feat. And what we had to do was we had to have Lockheed employees that were out in Burbank near LA flown in with parts from the plane, because we didn't want to fly a plane out there, or we didn't want to have, a big thing going down the highway, right? So they had to break it apart and then reassemble it out at Area 51, and then that's where they would do their test flying. So these birds could go over 70,000 feet up in the air. At the time, planes were flying not even half that high, more like 15, 20,000 feet. This was well above the Soviet defenses. So we were untouchable in terms of early operational life. And then there were other aircraft that came along there that had incredible capabilities. So I will tip back a little bit on the aliens. So why did this place become such a focus that there might be aliens there? Well, if you think about it, it was incredibly secret. The government must be up to something. Commercial planes did not fly as high as the U-2 or other planes that were being developed. So commercial pilots, not being briefed in on anything, would say, whoa, what is that way, way up there? How can anything like that fly up there? Sometimes at different times of the day or night, there'd be glints of light that might look like what we today have called flying saucers. When there was any kind of a wreck, the government had to, kind of keep people from finding out what it was. And oh, there's this big piece of metal. That must be a spaceship that has crashed. And what do they have hidden back there? And then it just kind of built upon itself. There's other stories that I won't go into, but it just became kind of this self-fulfilling cycle of stories where, oh, I heard about this,
Sure.
I heard about that. But if you think about it, in the 50s and 60s, strange lights, strange times of day, doing movements and heights that no other aircraft could do, it really just led people to believe that must have been spacecraft. Plus movies were coming out back then, and there was just this kind of sense of interest in alien life back then.
Well, and of course, people have always had that fascination, right? Are we alone in the universe? Or, you may have seen recently a former president came out and kind of confirmed on someone's podcast, and that's got people going even more down the rabbit hole. But,
I'll just comment on that real briefly. It's interesting.
Sure.
The
Sure.
intelligence community was called into Congress. I'm just going to say within the last couple of years. There was all this talk about, well, what do we have in the way of government records? And so the intelligence community, I won't get any more specific than that, briefed Congress. And I'll just say the members of Congress that received the briefing were incredibly disappointed. They were hoping there was going to be records. And so if you listen to the former president,
Sure.
he said, he believes there's aliens, but he's not seen any evidence. And the reason is, there is no evidence. And if you sometimes hear these former government officials that have said this or that, it's because they want attention. They want clicks. I can assure your audience, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, Department of War now, is not hiding aliens. We don't have any records of that. And I know that is very disappointing to folks up on the Hill. But that is what it is.
Sure. John, thanks so much for touching on that. Come on, I'll even, kind of admit, I've always kind of wondered too, and maybe felt, but also the rational part of my brain is like, let's keep some of it real. And if there is, right? But for viewers that are watching, and for, again, someone with John's background and his level is people have to realize that our adversaries are doing the same things that we are doing, right? I mean, it's a constant competition, if you will, if you want to use that word, for defense. So, in that world, in your world, whether some people like it or not, there has to be cover stories is part of it. There has to be to throw off your adversary. And people may have heard, it's kind of a, mouse and cat game back and forth. And people like yourself were good at it. And so are they. So for viewers, don't go too much into it, but I think, what John is saying is pretty much probably 99% of what goes on in Area 51 and the advanced stuff that we have. And thank goodness we do. Does that sound pretty good? Right on, I think?
Absolutely. And it's an incredible place with a tremendous mission that we should all be very proud of.
Yeah. Well, again, I know people have been fascinated with that location for years, and thanks for some of your insights. Also, in that vein, during that same time period, there is another historical event that happened with one of our first U-2 pilots that were testing and trying to gather some reconnaissance, Gary Powers. There are some, I remember, having gone to the same high school, I think we shared a little bit offline that, we discussed that incident in one of my history classes. And again, I can't remember how we did, but we did. And I remember thinking, as a 16, 17-year-old kid in high school, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Right? But go on to the historical event of Gary Powers and what happened there that I think maybe probably have come out of Area 51, that first U-2 spy plane over Russia.
Yeah.
All yours.
Absolutely. I'll say, we should recognize that anytime you're moving into some type of new technology, especially when it is airborne, there's great risk. 3 pilots actually lost their lives testing the U-2 plane. There were conditions with the plane that if you went too fast, it was going to tear apart. If you went too slow, it would stall and then drop and be at risk of being shot down. So these pilots really took the lives into their hands in the service of our nation and are true heroes. And one of those was Gary Francis Powers. And he was flying from a base in Pakistan into Soviet space and was shot down in 1960 rather. And he was later, I'll get to 1962 in a moment, but he was shot down. Fortunately, he was able to parachute and survive. And the Russians wanted to make quite a bit of news about this. Again, we're back in the Cold War. And so while we're worried about the Soviet Union to some degree is worried about the United States. And so there is a lot of tension between the countries. And the overflight, Russia knew we were doing overflights. They just hadn't been able to shoot us down yet. But their missile technology advanced to where they were able to shoot down one of the planes. So they'd been trying for some time. And they wanted proof so that they could counter the U.S., basically saying, hey, U.S., you say it's the Russians that are up to things. Well, look, you're up to something as well. So we tried to deny it. The United States, the Eisenhower administration tried to deny that it was a spy plane. It was an experiment. We got off course, hey, sorry about that. And then Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, the leader of the Soviet Union, comes out and says, well, wait a minute, we got the goods on you. Here's the plane and here's the pilot. Not much you can do at that point, Joe. They had the goods on.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah.
we had to acknowledge what had happened. Powers was sentenced to multiple years in prison. And this is just classic Soviet Union. They know he's not going to be a threat to them. They could have released him. He was a bargaining chip. And even today, when they will arrest somebody from the United States, it's so that they can use that person to then get somebody back that they want. And that's what happened back in 1962. Some people may have seen the movie Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks. I thought it was a pretty good movie. And this is where there was a exchange of spies, if you will, between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was a Russian spy. I'm convinced he was a spy, even with his denials. And it took place at a bridge that had been, at that time, connecting East and West Germany. And the movie does a better job of describing and illustrating it than I'll be able to do here in this podcast. But again, I recommend your viewers go watch that. But that was how we got Gary Powers back, was by turning over a spy. And there was another spy involved as well that was released in another area. I won't go into that right now. But that's how we got Gary Powers back, was by exchanging him for a Russian spy that we exchanged there at that bridge. Powers was able to return and then was cleared of any wrongdoing. And you might think, well, why would he be accused of any wrongdoing? Well, some would say, well, he should have committed suicide. I'm not of that mind. He was serving his country. He did what he could, and we got him back. He was not giving the Soviets, classified information. So I'm glad from a historical standpoint that he was cleared of any wrongdoing. Interestingly, when he came back, he took to flight in a different type of vehicle. He was a helicopter pilot, and interestingly, did airborne traffic reporting in the Los Angeles area. But kind of back to your question, Joe, as far as, what changed because of that U-2 shooting, that downing, the U.S. had to stop all airborne reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union. We did reconnaissance in other areas, but Soviet Union, we knew, would be able to shoot us down. Too great of a human risk, and as well as a political risk for us to do that. Fortunately, though, the U.S. had already been working towards space-based collection. And I can give you a little bit about that, but just maybe a closing note on the U-2 program. We should all be very proud of that. The Cuban Missile Crisis that I think a lot of people have heard about during the Kennedy administration, it was the U-2 that identified Russian missiles on Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States homeland. And it was the intelligence that we got from the U-2 that enabled our president at the time to stand up to the Soviets and say, no, get them out. And I'll tell you, we got very close. Our two countries got very close to war. I don't think people realize just how close we got to war between our nations. And it was the U-2's intelligence that I believe enabled our administration to avoid war. The U-2's been used for treaty verification, and even today, it's still being used. I'll leave it to people's imagination. But, when you can fly over an area for 12 hours at a pretty good altitude where you have secured airspace, it can still be used. But like I said earlier, it's probably coming to an end. What we're able to do with drones now, satellites, mean it's probably coming down to an end. But, Joe, like any great adventure, you just don't always know where you're going to go, because things come along that make you take a different course of action, right? You're hiking up a mountain and something makes you change course. And that's what happened after the U-2 shoot down. We had to go to space-based reconnaissance, and I'll be glad to fill you in a little bit on that as well, if you'd like.
Absolutely, and kind of in that little previous vein is we've shared the whole Adventure Joe podcast, and the whole name is my international travels and quite a lot of adventures. And you're right, people that haven't done some of that stuff, there's the old saying, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy can come along and always rear his ugly head. So you always have to have a plan B, plan C, down to plan Z. So, pretty fascinating. And kind of quickly going back on the original U-2, back in the 50s, what's fascinating to me, and hopefully viewers, and they'll research and educate themselves a little more, is the technology that we had at that time, even, right? It's pretty fascinating. I mean, I think some of those payloads, those cameras that were put on the U-2 were monstrous. They had to be able to, detect and do reconnaissance at 70,000 plus feet. So, what we have today, I mean, I can only imagine, and pretty fascinating stuff. So thanks to people like yourself who are a lot smarter than me to figure that stuff out. That's for sure. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you can get some into more of the space day stuff, because space stuff, again, I know we touched on it earlier, and some of your time, if you call it on loan, I guess, at NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, in our first podcast, is, touch on what you can. I think, viewers would like to hear, what they can from someone like yourself, obviously. But pretty fascinating. So, again, some of my travels, we could look up in, Antarctica. I was in Antarctica for a month. And I tell you, down there, you can look up and you can just see those things zipping around, and we're kind of like, is that a weather one, or is it one of our spy ones? Or and jokingly, we would wave and say, hey, can you see us? They probably could. Anyway, if you can get some of that, sure, that'd be great.
Absolutely. And it's all very fascinating to me. There's really kind of two eras in space reconnaissance. The first era, interestingly, has been greatly declassified. So I can talk a little bit more about that than some of the more current stages. Some of these programs people can look up: Corona, Gambit, Hexagon. We're really talking the early 60s through the mid 80s. And these satellites, Joe, were enormous. The size of a school bus. You talked about payloads, huge cameras, big lenses. But these early ones, interestingly, they had, no kidding, film inside of them. Kodak film. We worked with Kodak, and we had Kodak film in these. And what would happen is, after they would take pictures, we call it low Earth orbit, only a couple hundred miles up above the Earth, the film would be dropped was in a bucket, contained in a bucket, and that bucket would be dropped out of the satellite, and a parachute would be deployed.
Wow.
And then you'd have to have a Air Force cargo jet with this big hoop on it that would catch the bucket coming from the satellite with its parachute deployed. These are pretty good pilots being able to swoop that out. And then it would be processed, that film would be processed, exploited back at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in the Washington Navy Yard. Interestingly, that's where my first assignment was after graduating from Indiana University. Yes, I'm just going to say it. Indiana University, the reigning national football champions. Sorry, just had to get that out of my system. 16-0. Okay, I'll try to behave myself.
Absolutely.
Can't help it, Joe.
What a season that was.
It was an incredible season. But back at NPIC, that's where it would be exploited. They would have these, what they call light tables, and the film would go across it, and people would analyze what was there. And initially, the first satellites, it was about a 10-foot resolution. So you could tell if there was a small car in an area or not. But then later versions got down to about 2 feet. So now, you could tell if there was a tire on the ground, which was really improving. And then, these satellites were great for strategic requirements. How many bombers, how many missiles. In fact, it helped us to overcome this perceived Soviet missile gap. There was this belief that the Soviets had many more missiles than we had in the United States, and therefore the United States needed to spend, millions of more money to catch up. And actually, at the CIA, we're all about what is the truth, regardless of where it leads you. And we said, no, actually, the United States is doing pretty well against the Soviets, and we did not need to go and just, spend more money on those.
Yeah.
The thing about these satellites were, as great as they were, in one pass over the Soviet Union, it takes about an hour and a half to go around the entire Earth. One pass of the Soviet Union collected more imagery than all the U-2 flights combined. That's how incredible these satellites were. Very impressive. But then, again, good for strategic, good for counting things. But do you really want to wait for some, bucket to have to get caught, brought into, the Washington, D.C. area from the Pacific Ocean, then have people looking at it? It just wasn't quick enough for our, increasing threat. So that takes us, Joe, to the more current world of satellites, where now we call it electro-optical satellites. Think of it this way: digital cameras up in space, and the ability to downlink signals like satellites do today, and they downlink the imagery. So now we call it near real time, almost immediate, rather than waiting for that film to be brought to Washington. At our ground stations, we're immediately having that intelligence coming in. And I'll get to in a moment, how some incredible advancements have happened. But it's really an amazing technology that has taken us through. And again, I think it is really an adventure where we had to come up with a plane that did incredible things, a satellite that came up and was able to do incredible things, and now the most advanced technology you can imagine. That's about the end of what I can talk about from a unclassified standpoint. People wonder, hey, can they do video? Can you really read license plates? Is it in color? Can you do thermal imaging? I actually know the answers to all those things, but I'm just going to leave it to your viewers' imagination on what we can do. In fact, sometimes it's good to keep our adversaries guessing. So when a new movie comes out and they show that we are able to do some pretty good things, I like, all right, let's have our adversaries wonder just what our capabilities are. And in the meantime, we'll kind of keep quiet about it.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing. Well, and again, the movies, who interviewers going to come on and check the Adventure Joe podcast and yourself is, and they love this stuff. Like I think there was the one movie, Enemy of the State. I think Gene Hackman was in it, and I think they're talking about a satellite, and they're like, they're reading your license plate. They know where you are. True or not?
We'll leave it to your viewers to guess.
Exactly. Yeah. So back on some of the advancements, I know, again, kind of talking offline, I think it'd be kind of good for viewers to know, whatever sometimes their view of the agency is or whatever, Um, Mine is obviously a huge supporter. I probably met some patriots. I think in some of my travels we've talked about, and I know what they've done for our country from a security safety standpoint. I don't get into other stuff. John, what you can talk about, I think what's fascinating is what some of this technology that you know and are aware of that's also had impact, quote, on the civilian market, even the medical world. I think some of this technology, these cameras that were probably developed, by the U.S. government or the intel community, that's gone on to help detect breast cancer and stuff like that. So, can you take that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the technology has been incredible for intelligence purposes, but even from a greater purpose for the world. And have been some things that we've been able to use. So with that electro-optical satellites and the downloading of signals, a lot of the processing for these satellites is taking place on the ground, taking all these zeros and ones and turning it into something. An important need that we have is what's different from the last image that was taken. So again, you can go over the Earth every 90 minutes with one of these. What happened in the last 90 minutes? What changed? We call it change detection. And we came up with software to be able to essentially calculate what are all the different things in the pixels at point A, and then at point B, as you have all those pixels that have changed, what is it that we're looking for that's particularly of note? So let's just take something like a tank, just to keep it simple. Where was that item before? Where was that tank before? And where is it now? Or where is a convoy or what have you? And this change detection has been done by software algorithms. Well, we were able to transfer that into the medical community, and you mentioned breast cancer screening. So, a lot of times historically, breast cancer was being detected after there was already a sizable tissue mass that was identified, a lump. And now, what you want to do, of course, with any cancer, and breast cancer for sure, is to detect as soon as you can. So now this change detection software algorithm can be used to say, okay, here's a scan. Now, what is different in the next scan? To most, X-rays, MRIs, etc., you might not be able to detect something with just a visual interpretation. But with software, it can actually say, it can point you to what is different. That's a tremendous benefit that is out there, that change detection. Other areas, maybe not in the medical world, but still certainly in the consumer market, the advancements in batteries. Everybody wants their phone battery to last as long as they can, or other things that use batteries. Well, these satellites up in space, they run on batteries, and they have to be recharged by their solar arrays. So battery advancements very big. Digital cameras. I mean, that's what's really flying up there is a digital camera. It's looking. The light photons are entering the lens, and it's being converted from zeros and ones into imagery that can be used. That's a digital camera. So a lot of digital camera advancements, sensors for drones, GPS utilization, and then even civilian space exploration. So you think about the Hubble satellite and the James Webb satellite out there, looking into the universe. We've been able to
trying to find aliens,
or black holes or what have you.
I couldn't resist.
No, absolutely, exactly. These are advancements that we've been able to lead to. And then outside of space, interestingly, outside of spacecraft, the CIA has it started up a nonprofit venture capital firm back in the late 1990s. It was called InQtel, IN, and then dash Q, and then dash Tel. So think Intel with the Q being from, the James Bond movies. Q was the technologist that came up with everything. And it basically was a venture capital firm that invested in companies that had some promising technologies that we might want to use. I'll give you a couple examples. So Google Earth that we have today, that came about from a company the CIA, invested in that Google later purchased. And I'll tell you, Joe, the first time I pulled up Google Earth, I was like covering the screen up. I was like, uh-oh, these are classified. We can't have this. I mean, it was really good. But I mean, that Google Earth came about because of a CIA investment. There's a company that had a novel hearing aid. It was basically a two-way radio that you could hide in your mouth, and it would conduct sound through the bones in your mouth without having to wear an external hearing aid. Things of other areas, data analytics that we've invested in companies, encryption. Again, a lot of, in the private, consumer space, we want strong encryption. That's come about from what we've done. Obviously, when you have signals, coming down from space or terrestrial signals that we might be using, in our operations, you want to have really good encryption, cybersecurity, natural language processing, translating. I could go on. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, but just suffice it to say, I truly believe, albeit biased, that the world has become a better place, not just from a national security standpoint, but what we've been able to do with the transference of technologies.
Exactly. So you mentioned that bone technology. You're probably aware. You like to train and exercise, and there's one brand I would give it is Shocks. Is they use that bone technology, for sound and speaking music. So I think for a lot of people that aren't aware, I've done the research that probably a lot of things we see and viewers are using right now every single day, there's probably some parts either they see worked on or they invested on, a Google Earth. There you go. How many people have used Google Earth that probably did not know the full history and some of the involvement? So, some of it has actually made our lives better, easier, faster, and so forth. So, yeah, I'm glad you touched on those things for sure. Absolutely. So I want to go in another little direction if you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, part of my other life, and I'm actually getting ready to do one this weekend, is a private security event. So I still get some, contacts and work on some of that kind of stuff and some of the executive protection work that some are aware of. So current events. Right? We see a lot of current events going on, and I have people reaching out, Joe, what do you, I don't know anything, there's some things I'm aware of or informed of possibilities, but, with the current situation from Venezuela, some of the stuff you talked about that was a fascinating operation. It really was, to currently Iran. So, part of the Adventure Joe podcast is also preparedness and security. We touched on that in our first interview a little bit. But occurs from the first time we did the inaugural one till now, there wasn't the recent events. We're hearing a lot about, and experts like yourself, that it's, they're coming out, who they are, the background. And, if you watch the news, there's some expert with, similar background that are telling people, be aware of sleeper cells, be aware of this stuff. Is it something we really need to be concerned about, or what should people maybe be doing at this current time to help protect themselves, their communities, and so forth?
Yeah,
if you wouldn't mind.
Be glad to, Joe. A couple of comments, if I might, just briefly, in terms of the, operation that took place from an intelligence standpoint, without being able to, go into details. Let me just say that the intelligence community played a significant role that was just absolutely incredible. A lot of hard work, preparation, long hours. And your listeners should be proud of the folks that served well in their roles with this. Another item I'll mention is a person that people may have heard give briefings, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. He was a colleague of mine. Enjoyed being in daily meetings with him when he was at the CIA, and just a wonderful human being, very humble, always looking to give credit to other people. And I would encourage your listeners to pay attention to his briefings. He's probably the most articulate person that you can listen to about what is happening with the current situation with Iran and in the Middle East. And he is always looking after our service members and giving them credit. for the fallen, certainly expressing the appropriate sympathies for them. A shout out to a former colleague of mine who's doing great as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In terms of what listeners should be doing, I have a couple thoughts, Joe. One is we have to live our lives without being afraid. Those who want to do harm to us, those who are terrorists, maybe in sleeper cells, they win if we cower, if we hide. So my first piece of advice is you can't be so concerned as to not live your life, or they've won. That said, maybe a word I would use instead of concern, you asked, should people be concerned? A word I would recommend is aware. And I think that's really the key is being aware. I don't want anybody to live in fear, but I don't want anybody to not think there are risks that exist in the world. And so individually, for yourself, for your family, it is prudent to be keeping up on things in the news. It's prudent to be aware of where demonstrations might be happening. Where you live may come into play. You might be in an area where it really isn't going to touch your life. You might be in a large metropolitan area that has certain demographics that might be in tension, and you should be a little bit more aware about where there's gatherings, where people go. You probably should avoid some areas. Even if you're not involved, sometimes it's better to take a longer route to where you need to go. You don't want to be caught in the middle of something, is advice that I have. A lot of times people want to know about, well, what about traveling? Again, I think we have to go on with our lives. And is there a risk? Certainly. I'm not too concerned about the flight risk, but when you go to other countries, that's where a legitimate risk does exist. And the key there is not standing out. The key is blending in. The key is not being, by yourself, giving anybody an opportunity that would want to do harm. Think again about where there might be congregations of individuals that could turn into some type of a demonstration. Do a little bit of homework beforehand. What's going on in the location you're going to, whether it's a large city here in the United States or somewhere overseas. Be aware of the current events, what's happening. You're never going to be a risk-free individual, but you might want to, take a look at if there's a particularly volatile area, and there are some right now. Certainly, if you are, looking to travel to the Gulf states, maybe you delay travel there for a while, to be honest with you. But if you're going to travel to New Zealand, I don't really think you have the same level of risk there. So some of it is really just informing yourself, awareness, and then applying some savvy in the decision making that you have.
Sure. Great advice. And for some of those that, ask me here locally, even, it's what I would say. You can't live in constant fear. Be aware. But again, hearing it from yourself, I think always gives people a little more comfort and hopefully some ease of mind. Go on with your life, live it. I think you'll be fine. And keep in mind that there are professionals like yourself and others that are working, and doing their best to keep places safe. So, John, fascinating stuff. Again, back to the first topic, Area 51. So I guess I probably shouldn't try to take any hiking trips around there anytime soon.
I would take hiking trips into the wilderness area, but once you start seeing the signs, stay away from barbed wire, stay away from signs.
Yeah, and how many viewers that are hopefully going to watch the second podcast is, I think we talked about offline is some of these people that do a video, whatever, and they try to get as close as they can, and it's like, come on, people, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, John, fascinating stuff. Hope we can do something again soon. If there's anything else that you'd like to touch on that maybe we've missed, please go ahead and add. If not, then we'll maybe sign off and maybe look forward to a third one.
Joe, really enjoyed it. Always glad to talk with you, and look forward to connecting back up with you again on a future podcast.
Sounds great. And the viewers, I'm sorry if John disappointed you a little bit about an agreement at Area 51, but it was a great topic. I know we wanted to discuss and some of the history of that iconic place. But again, John, thank you so much for your time. Once again, I know you're a busy man, and thank you again for your service, and I really appreciate it. Again, Venture Joe Podcast, signing off with John Guyant. Thank you.